Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, now we are wired for sound. We're almost ready to start. Take our seats. So, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of the SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And then immediately let me make an apology for absence on the part of Silvia Colombo of the International Affairs Institute in Rome, who should have been here for today and indeed for tomorrow, but like the director of the International Affairs Institute, who was also going to be here, she's been stuck in Rome. The Norwegian flight from Rome to Stockholm was going to be delayed by 8 hours, and so that adds up to being a full day, more or less. Obviously, they were unable to make it. So apologies for that, but we remain with a fabulous panel for discussing our issue of insecurity in the refugee crisis. Whose crisis and whose security are we talking about? Let me begin with Rolf Ekéus, His Excellency Ambassador Rolf Ekéus, former chairman of the High Commissioner on National Minorities at the OSCE, and also, amongst many other claims to fame, a former chairman of the governing board of SIPRI, our institute. Let me also introduce Lina Grip, who is a researcher in the European Security Program at SIPRI, and thirdly, if I get out of the way so everybody can see him, Marcello De Filippo, who is the associate professor at the University of Pisa in Italy and works with the International Affairs Institute in Rome on these refugee issues. Before saying anything else and introducing the event this afternoon, I want to thank and acknowledge the Italian Embassy and the Istituto Italiano di Cultura here in Stockholm for working together to put this meeting on. We're very grateful. We would not have been able to do it without this support. And it is part of a process of SIPRI and the International Affairs Institute in Rome working out whether and how we can do a joint project together, a joint research on some of these issues of refugee flows, forced migration, and their relationship to the big issues of peace and security. So this is a very important part of that process for us. And I'd like to begin by asking the Italian ambassador, Elena Basile, to please take the floor and give us some remarks. Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I must say, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer and the Institute for International Affairs and the SIPRI for cooperating together on such a sensitive issue. When Dan Smith few months ago came to the embassy illustrating this initiative, of course, I tried to support it as I could, and with the Italian Cultural Institute, we decided to help from the point of view of organization and some financial aspects. Why? Because I think since I have been posted to Sweden, I realized that one of the priority for two partners belonging to two different regional blocs is to cooperate not only for the benefits of the bilateral cooperation, but for the cohesion, the European cohesion itself. And I think it's great that Sweden, that has a sovereignist tradition, and Italy, where we see more and more the national interest be identified with European integration, to countries with two different sensitivities to speak the same language, we can say, on the migration sector. And this is for me a demonstration that when the perception of the added value that Europe can provide in a sector is the right one, we can find a compromise among the 28 members and between completely different approaches. I would like to mention also the Migration Compact. Migration Compact, as probably you know, is an Italian proposal that we hope is going to be integrated by the reflection of the European institutions and inserted in the agenda. I think we are going to have an update the 7th of June of the agenda of the Commission for Migration, and re-elaborated for the European Council of the end of June. I have already heard some skeptical voices saying, well, nothing new under the sun, because in reality, this comprehensive strategy for Africa that Italy is focusing on with this proposal has been in the air for so many years. Everybody has heard about the Barcelona process or the Union for the Mediterranean. But in reality, the significance of this document is, first of all, to recall the urgency and to try to accelerate the implementation of goals that have been established by Europe itself in the Valletta Summit and with the dialogues that were launched by the Italian presidency, Rabat and Khartoum processes. Second of all is recalling the attention to the fact that if we don't have financial means, we cannot achieve this ambitious project we have. And the third is that we are not having only a comprehensive strategy with the long-term objectives, but we have also short-term objectives that should start being implemented immediately with concrete projects with the key partners, African key partners that have to be identified. Which is the difference between why Africa and, but we will, I'm sure, listen to that later on. It's because if the eastern route with the EU-Turkey agreement that, as you know, has so many controversial aspects, but has already achieved an important objective to reduce the number of immigrants coming from the Balkan road. If these refugees and migrants are above all escaping the Syria crisis, what we are seeing from Africa is a mix of refugee and economic migrants that are escaping political instability, poverty, climates, and demographic trends that are so different from the European ones. So this phenomenon is going to be with us for decades and deserves a very structured response. The document, the Migration Compact, as you know, has the logic of a partenariat. So there are things that Europe is offering, political, economic, logistic, and financial assistance to better the condition in these countries and have disincentive to migration. At the same time, we are asking the countries to be responsible for the management of the flows, for the border control, and we are compensating the countries that manage to have asylum policies that are respecting international standards. There will be a question of financial instrument, but maybe it will be treated in detail later on. So I just want to say that our proposal is very innovative. We talk about Europe-Africa bonds or European bonds on migration. Maybe this proposal has been controversial. We would like to listen to other proposals, but one thing is sure. If we had 6 billion for Turkey, we cannot have just 2 billion for Africa. So if I have well understood, maybe you know more than me, Europe, the European institutions are working on a starting capital that should, with the leverage of public and private funds, multiply the capital also for Africa. But I would like to stop here because we are all looking forward to listening to our scholars and Ambassador Ekeus. And I just want to say that this is the time to act. As we know, the more Europe is postponing the action on this crucial event, more we are leaving space to nationalism and fascist forces. And we should be scared, not to be immobile, but to react. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and again to repeat our appreciation of the cooperation and the working together on this. Before going any further, I just want to hold this up and wave it at you warningly. It's always a good idea to have these on silent, and it's always a good idea to check that you've got it on silent, as then otherwise, you know. Yes, I do have it on silent. It's actually the worst thing in the world when the moderator's own phone goes off halfway through the important meeting. So the ambassador referred at the end there to the toxic nature of this issue in European politics, and I think we have to have that quite in mind. And the toxic nature of it also reflects the very sensitive and emotional nature of it. I moved to Sweden at the beginning of September to take up this position. And a few days after I arrived here and settled into my apartment, then in the Merborgerplatsen, just around the corner from where I was living at the time, there was a nice big demonstration on the issue of refugees. And it was a demonstration addressed by the Prime Minister and by other leading political and cultural figures in Sweden, saying, "You are welcome. Come on, come all. You are welcome." Which is, by the way, what is supposed to be said to refugees. It did sound like something that was kind of wonderful to be saying, because it stood out compared to what was being said in many other European countries at the time. But actually, it's what you're supposed to say to refugees. If you have a well-founded fear of persecution, of the risk of death, the risk of serious injury, the risk of incarceration, then please, you are welcome. That's what the one way to understand the Convention on Refugees. So, I mean, since that moment in September, that extremely wet day in September last year, politics in some ways have changed, and rather sadly, as the pressure of the numbers of refugees started to take its toll on the Swedish bureaucracy for being able to handle it, and also on Swedish politics. So this is an issue where there's a toxicity in it. There's also a potential for great sadness in it, as well as for great generosity in it. And we shouldn't forget any of these emotional and psychological elements as we go through it. And I think that is part of what drove us to think of this title and this way into it. We've been talking about the refugee crisis for a year and a half, couple of years now. Is it a crisis? If it is, whose crisis is it? Whose security is really at stake here? These are the things that we need to think about seriously, and with an open mind. Communities which are feeling that large numbers of refugees are coming towards them should be taken seriously when they say and express that that is a problem. It could be that at some level their sense of security is at stake then. That should be listened to along with every other part of the concerns which are raised. This is a complex and multidimensional issue, and there aren't necessarily simple answers. But I wanted to start out the conversation by asking Lina a little bit, if you can, to tell us something about, in one sense, is this really a crisis? What's the scale of this in comparative perspective?
Thank you. I would start to say that it is a humanitarian crisis. We do have a crisis. We have the highest ever recorded number of refugees and displaced people in the world, 60 million last year. So it's
plus 10 million stateless people without states. So even worse than the 60.
If we look at the situation in Syria and around Syria, it's difficult to talk about the situation without thinking some sort of emergency or crisis, of course. Over 4 million refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey alone. Millions of internally displaced people inside of Syria. We have now in Ukraine 1.8 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. It's been registered. There is, as you know, the humanitarian summit going on today in Istanbul, where you talk about refugees, but also people in need of humanitarian aid, which could go into a broader category of groups. Then we talk about in the range of 125 million people worldwide in need of humanitarian aid. And if you compare this to 10 years ago, it's about 6 times greater than 10 years ago. I think our Ministry for International Development Cooperation earlier today say if this was a country, this 125 million people, if this group started a country, it would be the 11th largest country in the world. It doesn't mean that we haven't had crises before that cannot compare to this situation. Of course, in Europe, what we think of is the war in Yugoslavia and the refugee crisis from that and the amount of internally displaced people as well. So early 1990, we had about 3 million refugees and internally displaced people inside of Europe. Then at the time in Sweden, we also had the financial crisis, Swedish bank crisis coincided with that, just as we have in Europe now. The refugee crisis coincided with the European financial crisis. So I think it's difficult not to think of this as a very urgent and enormously seriously situation, but to put the humanitarian in front of the crisis and put the refugee in the center when we talk about this crisis. As you were saying, that we sometimes talk about the crisis as some other form of crisis, some sort of territorial attack on Europe. And I think although there are enormous, challenges, and we have a lot of issues that we need to solve together, and by no means are we handling or managing the situation perfectly. But not to forget that this is primarily a humanitarian crisis before other things.
Just help us with the figures, if you got them in your head. Maybe you do as well, Marcella. In the vicinity of Syria, right? Syria is a population before the war of around 22 million, and around 10 or 11 million people have fled their homes, right? Of whom about half have left the country.
Right.
Right. And the population of Jordan now is about 10 million, of whom 1/3 are refugees.
I think it's slightly less, but I think that might be the case in Lebanon. I mean, we have now over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon, I think.
In addition to 500,000 Palestinian refugees, right. Anyway, in a country of about 5 to 5.5 million.
And a country like Iraq, in spite of all the situation, and in Iraq they have 250,000 Syrian refugees, and the largest, of course, hosting country is Turkey, as we know. Right. I think it's about 2.5 million.
And then again, just to finish off the figures bit, last year there was about a million people who were moving towards Europe.
Towards Europe, yes. We had over 1 million people, not all of them from Syria, but
about
from
half from Syria.
I would say about half from Syria, maybe a bit more, and then Iraq, Afghanistan, also large source countries. About 1 million of them made the crossing over the Mediterranean Sea.
Right. Okay, just to sort of sort out a little bit the picture, and as I said, in comparative perspective, both comparative historically and with other countries today. Marcella, a comment, if you will, on how you understand whose crisis is it? For whom is this really truly a critical situation? Is it purely the humanitarian side, or is it also fair to think of it as being a political or some other kind of crisis for Europe as a whole?
Thank you, and I would like to thank the CIPRI and the Italian Embassy, the Italian Institute for Culture for having invited me, and I also try to speak in name of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, although I'm not a member of it, but just an external collaborator. So, well, I'm quite critical with the use of the expression refugee crisis or migration crisis because even like the figures say, it's a crisis of governance. It's a crisis of the community's spirit of the European Union. What we saw in the last 2 years is the absence of a sense of solidarity in a broad term and of being part of the same community of states. I think that the main point is that any state felt that it was the right way to behave was to behave alone or to establish a sort of national priority. Some countries who try to be, let's say, more holistic, to see the broader perspective, and also try to give an impulse for new solution, even provoking other countries. I can make the example of Sweden, but not because I'm in Sweden now, or Mare Nostrum in Italy, or the German decision to suspend the enforcement of Dublin regulation. Well, all those countries were left more or less alone. So this is a problem, and many countries of Europe, they just turn the face around, thinking or hoping that the problem will shift to neighbors or to other countries. So I think this is the big crisis. It's a crisis of governance and crisis of legitimacy of the European project. Then, of course, the numbers are very high, but nothing that a community of 28 states could not afford, could not manage. 1 million of newcomers can be managed by a community of 500 million of people and 28 states. This is the main problem, in my opinion. Think about what it's facing now Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey as well. This is a crisis for those countries, not for the whole Europe, in my opinion. And for the moment, I stop.
But I mean, the figures are relatively small, 1 million out of 500 million. But, you know, we know that there are voices, we hear them all the time, of what a problem this is. Where do you think that comes from? I mean, is there this crisis of governance, this crisis of solidarity, this lack of community feeling or common feeling, has grown out of something, right? Is the basis a long-term worry about migration and bringing together of that? Lena mentioned a possible association with the economic problems that the continent has been experiencing. How do you the next step of the explanation, where do you take it to?
Well, in my opinion, with the migration issues and the refugee issues, since too long time we are using the wrong words. We are exaggerating some problems, or we are making some associations between migrants and threat or a danger for our way of life, for our style of life. In the most of the cases, 99%, migrants are not dangerous, are not a problem, are just an opportunity for the economic system of Europe, also for the demography of our continent. We do need migrants. We do need also to have a different approach to the countries of origin and countries of transit, because if we categorize foreigners as problems, then we will ask to other countries to cooperate with us in many fields, not only on problem of borders or controls of flows, but also for every kind of international cooperation. They will tell us, you treated our citizens as enemies, as second-class persons. So the cooperation, the approach will be different. Think about the natural good relation that we should have with Latin America. Maybe this is my Italian origin that drives me to tell it. Latin American countries has generally a positive approach towards Europe. In many Latin American countries, they feel like all the Europeans. Take the Argentinians, for instance, so also the Brazilians for many aspects. Now, since some years, Latin American countries see Europe as a competitor, sometimes also as an enemy, because we keep on treating migrants as problems, as not fully citizens. So I think this is also a problem on the way we behave in the international arena. We do need cooperation from other regions, not only on migration, many other aspects. And we are showing our worst face, in my opinion, toward migrants. It's just an opinion, of course. It's not the truth.
Good to have opinions. Rolf, I want to go back to the point that Marcello made right at the beginning when he was speaking, which is this question of the absence of solidarity, a kind of a failure of solidarity. How much do you think we should be expecting that solidarity, either as between people and citizens and the refugees, or solidarity between the governments? How much realistically should we be expecting by way of solidarity in international politics?
Well, history is, I'm old enough to think in historical terms. That is the Cold War. It defined relations in economic, in political, ideological terms. When the breakdown of the Cold War came, suddenly something new. We had to find our identities through our language, our ethnicity, our something completely new, where the individual became much more important. And that's, of course, why I'm taking that up, because as High Commissioner of National Minorities, that was broke up completely, the society. So also I even older experience from Iraq, and we already mentioned that. Iraq was one must say, a dictatorship, very tough, reckless leadership, but it was a society where the different religious and the ethnicities were respected. It was the same with Syria, as a matter of fact, and to some degree also Libya. When these broke up, the ethnic differences started to break up, and majority-minority issues became furious. In Europe, of course, we had a similar. Yugoslavia was something got close to our heart, the Estonia, Latvia, where, of course, I worked in all these areas with the Russian minority. As High Commissioner, I was High Commissioner on, not for, observed very carefully when that was drafted. So it was a matter of address the problems, but not necessarily support. But what you created suddenly, a sense in Northern Africa, obviously, Arab world, of terrible breakup of the Iraqi military, which was a disciplined military. I don't like them, but they were quite professional. Break up the political party, which was open for all ethnicities, all religious characters. Broke down the whole society, and we got this terrible hatred and developments, which that were refugees were created out of that. Syria followed, was also ruled by a so-called Ba'ath party, which was reasonably fair to the different parties. Libya is another case. They had a dictator, but also there. So I don't dream of dictators coming back, certainly not. But we must be aware when that happened, this construction, not the political, ideological, communism against the democracy and so on, something totally different happened. And we were not prepared. We were helpless. But I think it's very important. I'd like to come back to what your experience from Medborgarplatsen, the experience where also the former Prime Minister said, let us open our heart. I think this is something we should keep, because I have a sense that it is a panic now. I think it is certainly, I'm so frightened when I hear your figures, but still this is a temporary element there that will be cooled down. And we have to be very careful before we start to treat, we should be prepared that the whole thing cools down. But also that demands something else. I have 1,000 things to say, so stop me. But what I think was, and that's very Swedish, our dream in Sweden when we worked out from my young years, development assistance. We should work to help other countries. We should use the wealth we had developed in happy years to share that with African states and with states in other regions in order to allow them to develop in their own countries, not force them to flee. But I think it is Europe has been too sloppy, not followed up these fundamental ideas of the best way to stop refugees is to make them happy where they are. Now, of course, now it is, as I said, the first problem is the ethnic hatred and the religious hatred. I recognize that. But we should, the undercurrent is that we should really, Europe, UN, we should work together to start to expand and develop serious policies and strategies for supporting economic and social developments in these countries.
So I'm going to take a kind of another round of questions to the panelists, right, from me, and then it becomes your turn. So start to think about that possibility. I wanted to step back a little bit from the long-term perspective that Rolf was finishing with, but to get into the question of security. And I must admit that I'm always a little bit nervous when I use concepts like the security dimensions of the refugee issue. I'm worried that somebody is going to be hearing me say something completely different from what I intend. Because I think that as one thinks about that, you know, the issue of politics being toxic, if you start to say refugee crisis and security issues in the same sentence, you do start to raise some kind of simple images of attack or, you know, sovereignty under threat and so on. But if we try and park those over one side and say that's not what we're talking about, what do you think are connections between the big issues of peace and security that we think about and the situation with refugees today?
Linking that to Europe or in general?
As you like.
Okay. I think what sort of stands out and actually refers back to your other question, the former question, I think that the refugee and the way we talk about refugees in Europe has been securitized. It has become a security problem. I think this comes from earlier we thought of refugees and larger migration flows were more thought of as a burden to our social welfare, for example, to our political systems or to cohesion. But now they are to a larger extent securitized, to think of them as a security threat, almost as if Europe is you know, we have facing an existential crisis of some sort because of large migration flows and especially refugee flows from the Middle East. And I think this is very worrying. And I think this is the securitization in itself is a security problem. And of course, if it also stirs up a lot of fear among individuals and local communities. But of course, if you feel that a lot of people that will come to your local, to your city or your local area or your country or to the EU, if that means that you are under security threat, of course you would be you would want to distance yourself to that. If you think that ISIS are hiding in refugee flows from Syria and they're planning, the next terrorist attack on Stockholm, of course you would want to avoid that. You would want to distance yourself from that. And the way to, the increasing trend to securitize refugee flows, to talk about them when we talk about crime, organized crime, when we talk about, criminal networks, when we talk about weapon smuggling, when we talk about terrorist attacks. I think this is a security problem. I think we're forgetting, so, as I sort of my point before, the humanitarian dimension, the humanitarian crisis that we are facing, which is not really a choice for us. Of course, we didn't create the problem, and we would like to solve the problem in the region by stopping the war in Syria. But in the meantime, we are facing a lot of people having to escape, and we have an international legal obligation to receive them and host them and actually protect these people in need. And it's not helpful to securitize that kind of discussion, and I think that creates a lot of resentment in Europe and a lot of opposition, which makes sense if you actually believe that you are under security threat from external sort of migration flows. Then you will react in a very different way compared to if you see civilians escaping war and would actually have liked to stay in their home country, for example, and they don't have some sort of vicious or aggressive plan in mind when they move. So
okay, but let me put you on the spot and ask you what you say to somebody who says, yes, but there are people from ISIS who are coming in those flows of refugees. What they are over dinner. Somebody, a friend, surprised you by saying, but it's true. There is that threat.
It is. It's a difficult question to answer, but it's not so surprising question because it actually happens at dinners nowadays. It didn't used to happen, but I do get this sorts of comment when explaining what kind of work we do at SIPRI. I think we have. I mean, the EU asylum policy and the system that we do have this in mind. I mean, we do. Have a system where we have to register and identify people, make sure that they are, legitimate refugees or asylum seekers. There is a process for doing that, and of course, then you need to work with intelligence. You need to work with security police, with law enforcement. Whether the question is that people slip through anyway, in spite of these individual checks on people. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that you commit a war crime, for example, and then in let's say in the genocide in Rwanda, you're taken as a refugee and you leave the country, and then 20 years later there is an investigation leading you to. So I mean, it has happened in the past, and I think one of the reasons why there are so many, hundreds of thousands of people stuck at the EU's external borders, because they're awaiting this sort of assessment. And this is really the problem with the system that we have. How do we make a quick assessment whether someone is a refugee, or someone is a war criminal, or someone is a terrorist? And how do we do that quickly when we have a million people pressing? So, so the answer is that we should have a system which do both.
How do we do that quickly when the governments are not cooperating together properly? I'm moving on to your side of the argument now. I'm answering the question that this idiot asked me at the dinner table, right? Because it seems to me that the more that governments, the more that people, the more that the media, the more that opinion makers turn away from cooperation on this kind of issue, then the harder it is to handle, because cooperation means there's more resources engaged. And part of what you're saying is simply the scale of the problem is such that it demands that cooperation.
Definitely we need, I think this is obvious to a lot of people, but we need an integrated approach to our external borders. Since we do have joint external borders, we cannot assume that Greece would be able to set up this procedure on their own and would have the resources and the capacity to implement it. So this is something, of course, that we would have to develop together. We could never eliminate all risks and there will always be errors, but as it looks now, we have more to fear from sort of homegrown terrorism than people slipping through the asylum system.
So, Marcello, if I ask to start again with you with the same question I asked Lena at the there, how do you understand the security connections or ramifications of the situation of refugees?
Yes, I have another point of view, another way of approaching this problem, but I would like to add something to your points. I've been also working on terrorism in the past, on my research activities and so on. And let's suppose that 10 members of ISIS had passed through the Greek islands last year. Maybe they are much less. Maybe they are just 2 or 3, as the evidence tells us. 10. About 1 million of persons came to Europe last year. So 10 people, 1 million of people. Think about how how many criminals there are in Sweden in the jails under a criminal trial, or even for bloody crimes. How many there are in Italy or in the whole Europe? So if we take this figure as justifying a policy response, or let's say a sort of mobilization of the media leaders, we're going nowhere. We have completely forgotten about rationality, because there are 10, 5, maybe 4 members of ISIS who did the trip to Syria and then they came back through the Turkey-Greek border. But is this enough to justify a closure of the borders? And moreover, if we build up a mega wall around Europe protecting us from the enemies that are outside, do we think that the number of the enemies will decrease? I think about what is going on in the Idonemi camp at the border between Macedonia and Greece. In this no man's land, with no rights, no respect for the people, where elder people, young people, families are left there, forgotten by Europe, of what happened in the Calais jungle, this is something we should be ashamed of. And I think if I were terrorist recruiters, I would know where to go. I would go there, and every day I would be speaking at the ears of someone. Look at Europe; they are our enemies. Let's do something very bad against them, because they don't deserve respect. They don't respect us, so we have to kill them. All of them, they are guilty. So we should also think about the propaganda. Fanatism is the step before terrorism. So if we adopt these kind of policies of closure, of treating normal people as potential terrorists or a threat to us, at the end we will do the game of the terrorists, the real ones. And I would like to add another thing.
Go ahead.
I think everyone here has heard about the expression Fortress Europe. I think it's very used by many NGOs that are very, let's say, on one side on some occasion. I don't like to use slogans, but it's true that from a legal and also from a policy point of view, in the last 20 years, not in the last 2 months, in the last 20 years, Europe has built a system whose results are excluding from a possibility, from a chance to come legally many potential migrants, not only economic migrants, but also for family reunification purposes or for asylum. And so we leave no other chance to these people that they don't want to be irregular migrants. They wouldn't like to come that way. They would like to come legally, but they don't have any other chance. So they choose the irregular way, and so they enter into a very dangerous market, that is the smuggling of migrants market. And this market is very profitable. So this is a problem of security for Europe, because the money generated by this market is going in someone's hands. Let's ask to each other which hands. The hands of organized crime, the hands sometimes of terrorist organizations, the hands of persons who destabilize governments who are in our neighborhood. So if there is destabilization in North Africa, in Middle East, in Eastern Europe, it's a problem of security of Italy, of Sweden, of Ireland, of Norway or every European state. So this is an issue of security generated by wrong migration policy. It is not done in the last 2 years, but in the last 20 years. So maybe we should really think about the way we treat migration flows. We must not dramatize migration. Migration is a common phenomenon, it's a physiological phenomenon. It will exist always. It has been always existed. Maybe, I don't know if Sweden has known a period of emigration in its history. I'm not so expert of Sweden history, but for instance, many of the European countries that now are claiming for restrictive migration policies, they have received many benefits by emigration. But our memory is too short. Maybe this is a problem.
Rolf, can I ask you to pick up from where you left off? You mentioned the importance, that people, if they're happy where they are not going to be so tempted or feel so forced to move. What kind of combination of policies or approaches, or at least combination of approaches, can you see that would begin to move policy into a more creative direction?
Yeah, I think that the challenges is that we now, I admire these beautiful presentations, but they're talking on, they have arrived. That is, we start to think, why are they coming here? You say, terrorist. What is terrorist? Look at each one of the terrorists. Is it a Shia Muslim? Is it a Sunni Muslim? Are all Shias gangsters? Are all Sunnis gangsters? I mean, it is a pathetic lack of, we have to look at what has caused the terrorism, what are the roots of terrorism. And there, of course, we have to build strategies. We have to think much Europe, and there we have to think in the UN. I remember when I was High Commissioner and was very enthusiastic about the work. I think we were successful in Estonia and Latvia and Kosovo and elsewhere. Now I see there are problems. So I went to the United Nations and I went to my friend Kofi Annan and said, look here, we see in the world how it's coming up ethnic hatred, religious hatred, majorities oppressing minorities. This is not, we have in Europe created that job. Couldn't we create a United Nations, so to say, system for dealing with minority issues and bring them in? And Kofi was enthusiastic, so he organized a meeting with me and the African group in the UN. And I made my enthusiastic presentation. And I was treated with coldness. That was something Africa could not accept, that was something, it is too complicated, and maybe they're right. You can't break up religious and ethnic feelings that easily. So it was a rather naive guy from Scandinavia talking about how one could do good things. It was considered unrealistic. But still, I think we shouldn't give up on that. I think we have to really try to address these issues by engaging much more in, and I think there Italy has a leading, and the ambassador really told us about that, the responsibility to lead and engage Europe in engaging with the roots where terrorism is rooted. And ISIS guy is coming. He's driven by religious conviction. And we have to address these problems one way. And as I've seen it in detail anyhow in Iraq for 6 years, where there was a difference, of course, at that time. You could go, clocks in the Catholic Church were clinging at the same time as there was from the prayers were called out for believers in Baghdad. It took the same place, same time. It was possible. Again, no, this guy is praising Saddam. I'm not doing that. But I think it is important that we should also look at this long term. But we're talking about Europe. I recognize that. It is. And I would like us to add one little thing, again, coming back just about Sweden. That is that Sweden has been very lucky in war. Early, it was Italians coming immediately after the Second World War, created a lot of, so to say, success, economic success. Then came from the Yugoslavia, various, which also drove the economy, Swedish economy forward. Then Iranians came and made a great success also in Sweden. So why Reinfeldt and Löfven were welcoming, it was a history for us. They strengthened us, it is a richer culture and work. It was something, open our heart. That was so, I was moved and proud about these two prime ministers' attitude. And I think we shouldn't panic. I think there is a tendency of panic. I think we should, I'm sorry to say that, but of course we must calculate the hard facts. We should not run away from them. But I think we need to start to be, so to say, more creative and also work together in the EU context with friends, especially those who are Greece and Italy and so on, those who are exposed very much in this context.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you, so far for the comments. I think that this really is opening up the multiple dimensions of this and the possibilities of different perspectives and nuances around it, which are not unimportant. So if we ask for some questions, first one here I see at the front already.
I think I'm going to just to try to contribute, because you have made a huge effort and the debate has been very interesting and you were behind every question. It's not the first time we have admired your performance. But really, it is a very difficult topic. So what I'm going to say will be just my personal experience, and then I will listen to any. I will start remembering something which has really influenced my professional life. In 1990, I was the chief of cabinet of the state secretary for foreign affairs. And we were asked by the whole world community to face a huge problem with the boat people in Asia. Mm-hmm. We traveled and we were, let's say, a small country in the sense that we were far away. We had no experience with Vietnamese people, no experience at all. But at the end of the day, we had to accept a political demand from this international conference. My boss, Robert Piquet, raised his hand and without any instruction accepted 500 people. Well, when we came back to Madrid, I was the fellow to try to manage to bring 500 boat people into Spain in 1980, which was not a very easy thing. It was almost impossible. To tell you the truth, we paid fortunes, we rented houses, we paid for a school, we brought interpreters, and at the end of the day, little by little, every one of them left with our help. And most of them went to America. Others went to Australia, where they wanted to go, and of course, Australia couldn't accept them. So from this moment, I am very pragmatic. So that means that I think that we are, the European Union, at a point where there is a fight. But I think the winner is pragmatism. Idealism is not anymore a valid element to settle the crisis. And that's why perhaps we are suffering so many defeats in the political field, because we are saying platitudes which have nothing to do with real life. Mm-hmm. For instance, of course, Europe is based on equal rights by all countries. But I cannot deny that, let's say, Spain is very good at handling Latin American people. We have, I don't know how many millions. And this even, we have a very open legislation. Any Latin American people, any illegal, after 4 years, he becomes illegal. So, I mean, they continue coming. And this is not refugees. It is an economic issue. People enjoy to come to Spain, have a double nationality, etc. So, well, more or less till now we have managed. Since we were having a boom, they were being very helpful to really contribute to. We also were, I was at the time in the north of Morocco, consul there, issuing hundreds of visas, interviewing thousands of people. We were quite good at welcoming also Moroccan people, especially from the north of Spain, because that, as you remember, was a Spanish protectorate till 1956. The south and the center, most of the country was a French protectorate, but not the north. And so our experience is that you can handle what you can handle. So we had to face a new phenomenon, which was new for us, was a sub-Saharan people coming into Spain for economic reasons, and that was in the 80s. And we succeeded because there were not millions, there were few countries, and we managed to go through what you were mentioning, trying to offer international cooperation, trying to help the police to interfere with this human trafficking. So I would like to I think even Elena, when she was speaking...
Yes, Ambassador, could you
Yes,
do a question?
I will finish. No? Because my point is that we need to look for practical issues, one by one. We cannot settle every problem. If we are dealing with the refugee issues coming from Syria, we have to try to settle the refugee issue. But we cannot offer to all Syrian refugees that they will be welcome in Europe, because there is no way. There is no possibility. We have to deal with those who have arrived. Then later on, a new problem will start. I agree that Africa might become a problem. Asia is going to be a problem in the future. So this would be try. We have to not to be too idealist in this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I should have asked that you speakers introduce themselves when they make remarks from the floor. This is His Excellency the Ambassador of Spain. Is there another question, one further? Well, actually, there's one right close to you, Stephanie, behind you. So, and then one further back, up there.
Hi, thank you. I'm Catalina Uribe. I'm a program officer at International IDEA, so neighbors. And I just wanted to thank you very much. Very, very interesting presentations and discussions. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more also on the issue of, well, you made a very good job, I think, sort of pressuring for some insights into the coffee table or the dinner table questions on security, which even if they are very narrow, one needs to address because these are issues that especially voters are looking at. And, well, also I think this right-wing strength that some parties have gathered really reflects these unresponded issues. And I'm wondering, you mentioned sort of the security or insecurity supposed threats coming from these refugee flows, which I think was very well taken, but also on sort of insecurity issues arising from inadequate integration of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants in general, is also another aspect of this that is often sort of brought up in this discussion. And I was wondering if you could also elaborate on that into what measures, also in this realm of having a joint Europe, but this being essentially national sovereign decisions on integration. So.
And then if we take a third question and then give you a chance to come back on all three. And again, please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Bakr Fattah, Ambassador of Iraq. Thank you for this very interesting presentation and discussion. And I think I have more commentary than question because I think that this crisis, in principle, it's a political crisis in Europe. You know that. As I see that the problem is the consequence of the crisis in Syria, especially because the key solutions for the crisis is in Syria. And this problem of the refugees It's a consequence of the political crisis in Syria, and this political crisis it be solved by involving all of first the regional power and the international great power. They have a lot of influence for get a kind of solution, of political solution. Meanwhile, this problem it's not solved. I cannot see that there is a solution for the I'm saying the crisis of the refugee. And the second is also it's economic crisis. It is a security crisis. It's a financial crisis. So, and second, as I hear that there's a lot of refugees in all of the regions, and Iraq exactly because I hear that just only mentioned before 250,000 Syrian refugees in Iraq, but we have more than 3 million and have displaced people. It's like a refugee also. So it's also the threat, and very, very big threat for the futures if you not get a kind of solutions. And for the problem of the Iraq, as I hear from the Mr. Ralph, that before I don't use the term of liberation or occupation, I use the term of changement of the regime of Iraq. Before the changement of the regime of Iraq also, we have the problem of the ethnic cleansing, exactly. It has happened in Iraq, and genocide was happened in Iraq. But after the changement of the regime of Iraq, I think the problem was the mistake which take place by the United States, and also the involvement of the regional countries to don't let this process, democratic process in Iraq, to be successful. And so it is led that now we see this very, very deep crisis in Iraq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So we've got a combination of issues here. Pragmatism, not idealism. The deficient integration leading to insecurity issues. And the relationship in the case of Syria, leaving aside the ambassador's last comment about the sort of declining diversity in Iraq, which is a longer-term trend, which I think has accelerated in the last 15 years or so, but is a trend which goes back way before 2003. But is the issue of the relationship between political prospects in Syria and the handling of the issues around refugees. Lena, where do you want to dive into that pool and select what it is that you have the first choice, and then Marcello will have the second choice, and Rolf is going to get whatever's left.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, maybe the middle one, since I was the one bringing up the securitization. Yes, I think this is a very serious problem and challenge that we have ahead. We are now having problems managing simply identification and registration of people, since unfortunately it doesn't seem as the war in Syria is going to end anytime soon. A lot of these people arriving now are likely to stay, settle. Maybe, a lot of children arriving, going to school. This will, Europe will be their home. Even after the war ended, maybe they're so settled here that they don't see an incentive to go back. The lack of integration and polarization is, I think, a much larger and more serious potential security risk than the current simply flow of people into Europe. I mean, we have already in Germany last year attacks on refugee homes increased, fourfolded over 1 year. We had it in Sweden as well, people setting fires to refugee homes. When I'm just, hypothetically, we're social scientists are not great for predicting the future, but there's just so much of this sort of attack and hatred. I would feel if this was me, that you can take until you start fighting back. Of course, while you're waiting for approval to stay and you just escape the war, I would think you're not very likely to engage in any kind of provocation or violence. But the next generation with no memory of a war, who have settled here and wonder why they are discriminated at the job market, for example, why they are, called things or under sort of attack. And there, if we look at previous experience, I mean, we have had problems with integration in the past. So we have to seriously consider what our plan of action would be. Otherwise, I think we see polarization in our societies. We see increased sort of social conflict between groups, which I think that Ambassador Keos referred to. I think we see this also in Europe, and these sort of potential clashes and the creation of identities around, not common values, but where ethnicity or where you're from, or how many generations you lived in the country, could be potentially extremely problematic. I mean, we've seen in the short term these sort of uprisings in urban areas as a result of, explained by sort of lack of integration. It's also frustration around not having sort of other outlets of affecting your situation. So you sort of burn cars and take to the street. Lack of confidence in political authorities, including law enforcement, which means that you might not call the police if you have a problem. You might find other ways of providing for your security. So there's a broad range of potential risk with the lack of integration, and if we see more polarization and segregation in society, which I think is a far more, important potential security threat than simply the flows of people into the continent.
I think if I were going, I'm never pessimistic. I'm a very cheerful, optimistic person. But if I were going to be pessimistic about this, I think that one of the things that I would think about is that we seem to live in a period where in several countries, politics is getting more and more angry. And the political discourse, therefore, is very often it's less and less about the issue, and it's more and more about something else. And there's this expression used in British English: you play the man, not the ball. Right? It's a metaphor out of football, and it's when you go and you just kick the player, and that's your way of getting the ball. And that's what a lot of politics is looking like at the moment. Is increasingly you express and you say whatever is needed to kind of try to smash down and disrespect the opposition in the argument, rather than try to understand and have a rational debate. And I don't think this is predominant about politics, but I think it's a trend which I see there. And that, I think, is a worry, because when you add that to that kind of the marginalization and the polarization, and you have a certain kind of alienation away from a political process as it was, and people feeling excluded from that, and then all of that anger coming through. I think there's a very dangerous mix there to which we need to pay attention. Make me optimistic again.
Well, a couple of words about integration process, and not to just to add something to what you already underlined. And I think it's a big problem at this age when the expenditure for the welfare, the social interventions are really reduced for the argument of savings. We have to save money, we have to reduce social expenditure. But we also should think if this is rentable in the medium and long term, because if you build walls in your society, you exclude people, then these people will be attracted by forms of extremism, radicalism, fanatism, and maybe also terrorism. Let's think about the nationality of the terrorists behind the Madrid attacks, the London attacks, Paris and Brussels. They were not coming from outside. They were citizens, nationals of the country. Maybe they were third generation, second generation, but they were raised in our country. So we have a problem of internal cohesion of our societies. So maybe we should think if we are saving 2% of the national budget for social expenditure, and are we really saving something? Or this is just a question mark. And the other problem is about pragmatism and idealism. I totally share your view. You have to be pragmatic, but I think that we cannot choose the approach to solve just one problem at once, because otherwise it's sort of a chain reaction. Make just an example. When in Italy we closed the route from Libya, the smuggling route that just came to Turkey and then to Greece. So we didn't solve anything from the point of view of Europe. We solved an internal problem with Lampedusa and Sicily, but we shift the problem to Greece and to the Balkan routes and to Germany and to Sweden. So it was not a way to solve the problem. It was short-term policy, unilateralistic, with no prospects in the medium and long term. I think I always, when I speak with Spanish colleagues, I recall the example of the Plan Africa that you mentioned it implicitly. I think it's a really interesting experiment. And I think that part of the La Valletta Plan, also the Migration Compact, they build on the same concepts. We should make a comprehensive deal with African countries. We must be pragmatic, but also we must be ambitious. We just not have to look only to the next elections or to the next referendum. Otherwise, we will not go nowhere, in my opinion.
Rolf.
I'm thinking about in the late second half of the 19th century, Swedes were massively fleeing this country. It was tough to live here. It may still is to some degree, but they fled to the United States of America. And there they were part of creating a very affluent and great work, and they did a great work. All didn't succeed, they returned, but it was, I think, something which is deeply rooted in the rest of us who stayed, namely that one should have respect. If you look upon those who are now fleeing from Syria, especially, I think, about Damascus, those who have been in Damascus know in old times it was wonderful city, intellectuals, arts, precisely like Beirut. And you know, those who pack up, take their children and go together, they have decided we can't stand this suffering. And I think that is both, I would say, courage, but it's something else. It's also a responsibility, a human strength that they really don't accept to be treated like shit, excuse me. We will do something else, and we should know that those are coming out. Yes, there are gangsters, there are all guys who place money on this, and we have to have, I support the government's efforts to get good police organization and all this terrible thing. But the fundamental thing is that there are good people that are coming. I think we must be, and I think I give a positive note to what Lina and Dan is saying. We must have that as a starter. Then we have to handle the rotten apples. We have to deal with this problem, but we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't hate them, or this is something which is happening. This, in the history, this will be an interesting moment, but not necessarily a catastrophic moment for Europe or for little Sweden.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, if we can make them relatively quick. One back there, and then one at the front to finish off. But again...
Yes, thank you very much. Christian Schönenberger, I'm the ambassador of Switzerland to Sweden. A question to Mr. Ekeus. You mentioned the different waves of emigration from Sweden and immigration into Sweden from Italy, from other countries. Now the question is, are today's refugees really the same mix than those? I think Europeans were rather easy to integrate. Now we have people from Afghanistan, from other places. And I was attending a meeting recently of OECD, not OCD, which was about labor market integration. And it seems that the people who now come, the mix that is coming, has a mismatch with respect to the needs of the labor market. So it's not only that, I think it's not only a concept of our mind that we feel threatened, where we shouldn't feel threatened, but I think there's also real problems of absorption into labor market and social systems.
Thank you. And the question at the front here.
My name is Fabia Midman. I represent the Euromed Civil Platform. I would like to say that both of you, Lina and Ambassador Ekeus, have mentioned that this crisis has been put on us. It means it is the result of wars that have created this crisis. It is time for the European to ask the United States to finance part of this crisis, particularly for Italy or Spain or Greece, because the European Union has already given enough money for Turkey, another flank. The United States has not taken its responsibility, neither in the reconstruction of Iraq or in taking care of the refugee issue. 2,500 refugees are welcome to the United States. 2,500 refugees from Syria. It's a shame. The United States has created many of these crises, maybe to solve other problems, but we in Europe are receiving the consequences of this crisis. Whether we contributed or not, we are facing this dilemma. But we do not have the means anymore. Europe has had a terrible economic crisis. We are facing a Brexit, which is also another complication. The problems of Europe have multiplied, so the finances have to come from maybe Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton or whoever. They are very wealthy over there. And finally, they have now found their oil, which means there will be less wars in the oil-rich countries. That was my
Thank you very much. So, on the one hand, the question of the sort of the labour market mismatch and the degree to which that is part of the problem that we're talking about, and on the other hand, whether the EU should ask the US for financing for the refugee crisis. And I urge you to try to give a 1-minute response to this, because then I'm going to ask you one more question and we close off. And we'll take it in the order that we're getting used to. So, Lina,
Sure.
you go first.
Yes, I think it's important. I definitely agree that there will be labor market challenges in integration. I think this is just something that we will have to deal with. I'm not the right person to ask or to give advice on exactly how those measures would be, but if you compare to the Italian immigration to Sweden, which was for labor, for work reason, and not for crisis-driven or conflict-driven migration, we cannot accept that people who are driven from their homes because of conflict perfectly fit our demands for skilled workers or what it is. So there has to be extensive of course, efforts in order to try to match as great as we can. But we should not accept that, the people coming are to sort of only for our own benefit. There will definitely be challenges in integrating them into Europe. In the case of Sweden, this might be more than 1 minute, we have had an enormous problem with integrating immigrants broadly, not only refugees, into the work market. So I think this was something that we can assume that we will have to work on in order to match this. There are definitely more things that we could do, because a lot of them are, teachers or engineers or doctors and are skilled, and we do have a demand, but they're still not integrated. So there are more than, the problem on unskilled people fleeing to the country, but the problem of integrating also skilled workers and those that there is actually a demand for, even to integrate those. And I definitely think it's a disgrace with the United States. They're not even in Istanbul, I think, at this World Humanitarian Summit today from the G7. I think only Angela Merkel is actually in Istanbul today to discuss these issues from the heads of states. Barack Obama said, I think, at the beginning of the year or end of last year, that they were aiming at 10,000, the resettlement of 10,000 Syrian refugees to the United States during this year. I think now it's 1,500 or so. So they're not likely to even meet this not very ambitious target. So I do think we should, as I tried to frame it in the beginning, we have a global humanitarian crisis, which we need a global response. Of course, Europe, because it's in our neighborhood and we do have the wealth and the stability to take on a large responsibility, but doesn't mean that we are, responsible on our own.
Marcello?
Just 20 seconds to answer to the problem of the mismatch on the labor markets. I think that for refugees, the subject is really complicated because we cannot pretend, as you perfectly said. I think one solution could be this one in the European Union. I think all of you know about the Dublin regulation. I mean, this legal mechanism which obliges the state who hosts in the first period the refugee to take him or her for at least 5 years or 6 years. So a very simple solution would be if this refugee, recognized refugee, receives a job offer from another country, after 1 year, he can go. So the mismatch in the labor market would be solved immediately as the spontaneous match between a demand and an offer in another country. But also on this, there is a total lack of logics at European level. The Dublin regulation is still considered a cornerstone of a system which doesn't work. But still in the last document, the 4th of May of the European Commission, the famous Dublin 4 regulation, we will see Dublin 4, 3 have not been enough. We want a 4th Dublin, the cornerstone. They still say that this is a cornerstone and the refugee is obliged in a cage to stay for at least 5 years in a country where maybe he has not social, cultural connection.
That's the country of first country that the refugee gets to.
Can be the first country of arrival, can be the country of relocation, of resettlement as well, because for instance Sweden is a fantastic tradition of resettlement, and also about relocation is one of the few countries which did some relocation in the scheme of the last year. But of course the refugee come here maybe has not the right labor qualifications, so if after 6 months or 1 year he receives an offer from Luxembourg, let's say, why shouldn't this person can go to Luxembourg to work when there is a company offering a job? Why? But there is something strange in our European Union. Well, we like Dublin. I love Dublin. I love Ireland.
The Irish ambassador.
I would like that Dublin will come back to be famous for the Guinness, for the Temple Bar, and for the landscape. It's fantastic. For the oysters of Cork, but not for this regulation. It's terrible.
Rob.
Well, first of all, I think there's so good answers from Lina, but still there are problems which are not, we overplay them. Just one example, the Iranian immigration into Sweden was, of course, a result of the Islamic revolution, a very tough, aggressive revolution, I will say, with all respect. So, of course, the type of people who were coming were fleeing from that fundamentalistic, aggressive revolution. So, of course, it was upper class, they were well educated, so they were fantastically, easily integrated in Sweden. Refugees from Syria, in a sense, they are not ISIS normally. They are also flying from terrorism. And I said before, they have the courage to decide instead of staying and suffer under this. They have taken important decisions when they move, and we should, maybe we shouldn't love them, but we should understand that there is a courageous, terrible decision they have taken. They're fleeing from something awful, but it also to leave one's home totally different from going up to this cold country up here. I think we should be very respectful. Still, of course, there is a mismatch. I can't deny that. And Lina has also said there is a mismatch. But we also have better tools now. We have, let me then boast about the High Commission on National Minorities. In the OSCE, we have developed understanding how important these minority issues are. And there is developing, I mean, both in academia, in the political life and intellectuals, we are developing a deeper understanding of these things. We are much more, things have happened in the last 50 years. We are more sophisticated now. And so certainly there are elements probably they cannot overcome this tremendous mismatch. There are too many people you are sending us. But I still think we should be open for these fantastic possibilities. We may be enriched up in Europe of these refugees also, intellectually, morally, and so on. There may be new things which will happen to us.
So we're coming now to the very end, just as we really begin to open the question up. You know, time is always against us with these things. But I want a final thought from each of you. Right? So the challenge is, you know, is a one-liner or at least a one-sentencer, and you can't have more than 2 semicolons in it. Right? What is it that you think? Where is there some evidence, some sign, some possibility that we come through this situation in a politically and a socially healthy way, and that the toxicity, the difficulties around all of this issue that we see and we understand, that we manage to, you know, we find the antidote to them. Where do you think the grounds for hope are that we come through in a politically and socially healthy way?
I think when we start to talk with the refugees rather than about the refugees, so including the people that we are talking about and who come to us, that we include them in decision making and in shaping the future governance system.
Brilliant. Marcella?
I would say, can you hear me? Yeah.
You can now.
I would say that every civilization or country who choose to close the windows and the doors ended by dying for lack of oxygen. I wouldn't add anything more.
Likewise,
brilliant. Rolf?
Well, my answer is not brilliant. I would say one word, in a sense, the Angela Merkel. Her reaction was so fantastic. Germany with its terrible history, and her experience is being brought up in East Germany. But the powerful and courageous way she did it. Oh, she got set back. Now she is attacked. Her popularity is sinking. But still, I think there was something really fantastic in the way she took the lead in Europe and gave us, in a sense, all Europeans, a little sense of pride anyhow. And also our little governments, I think both the two have behaved not too bad anyhow. And I think there are others in Europe also, but let us give credit to Merkel.
Yes, political leadership, when there's real political leadership, is worth an awful lot. I want to finish off by answering my own question by turning actually to London, to the United Kingdom. It's been mentioned today in terms of Brexit, and it could be mentioned in lots of other kinds of ways. And it's not very often that good news comes out of British politics these days, but quite recently it did. We had the election for the Mayor of London. And now the mayor of one of the world's great cities is a practicing Muslim. And when a very divisive campaign on religious and ethnic grounds was waged against him, the result was the biggest majority that a London mayoral election has been won by, 57 to 43%. And I think it shows that there is a possibility, there is an energy there which can be mobilized if it is found in the right way. We've seen that before, and you see this kind of process of dipping down into the grounds of fear and then of coming out of that. And there is a positive energy which is available, which can be tapped by the right kind of political leadership. So it's been a superbly interesting discussion. I hope the people who've been watching the live streaming have also been interested by it. And I think we'll be putting up excerpts from this on our YouTube site quite shortly. That's all for now, but would you join with me in thanking the panel for fabulous presentation?
Thank you. Du applåderar dig själv. Det var fantastiskt.